Pastor Ed here with our weekly devotion for the week of the fifth Sunday after Epiphany, focusing today on really the second half of the gospel reading this past Sunday, the John 5, 1 through 18, and thinking and talking about that particular passage. Let me reread it for you. After this, there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there is a pool called in Hebrew Bethesda, which has 5 porticos. In these lay many ill, blind, lame, and paralyzed people. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he'd been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" And the ill man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." And Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat, and walk." And at once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was a Sabbath, so the Jews said to the man who had been cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your mat." But he answered them, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Take up your mat and walk.'" And they asked him, "Well, who is the man who said to you, 'Take it up and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had disappeared in the crowd that was there. Later Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you've been made well. Do not sin anymore so that nothing worse happens to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well, and therefore the Jews started persecuting Jesus because he was doing such things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is still working, and I also am working." For this reason, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but he was also calling God his own Father, thereby making himself equal to God. Tony Campolo is a well-known Baptist minister and speaker, author. You've heard me mention him before. Now, retired for many years, he was a professor. Now retired for many years, he was a professor of sociology at Eastern University in Philadelphia, just in Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. He's also the founder and president of the Evangelical Association for the Promotion of Education, or EAPE for short, which is a missionary organization committed to creating programs to help the poor in third world countries, as well as in at-risk neighborhoods across the U.S. and Canada. They've done some wonderful work for which he's justifiably proud. But Tony himself tells the following story. It's about a time when he was perhaps so focused on the quote-unquote bigger picture that he completely ignored an opportunity to serve and perhaps even save a child in need. During one of his many mission trips to this particular corner of the world, he was on a landing strip just outside the border of the Dominican Republic in northern Haiti. A small airplane was supposed to pick him up and then fly him back to the capital city. Well, as he stood there searching the sky for the plane's arrival, a woman approached him holding her child in her arms. The baby was emaciated. His arms and legs hung from his little body as though they were sticks. The child's stomach was swollen 4 or 5 times the normal size, not because he had had too much to eat, of course, but because he had had too little. The woman held up her child and began to plead with Tony, take my baby, please. Mister, take my baby. If you don't take my baby, he will die, so take my baby, please. Take my baby." Tony's initial reaction, though, was to tell her that there was really nothing he could do to help her, and he tried his best to patiently explain to her all the reasons why he couldn't take her baby. And when that didn't work, he then simply looked away. But no matter which direction he turned, she would still be in his face, standing there in front of him, continuing to plead with him to take her child. "Make my baby your baby," she kept repeating. "Feed my baby. Take my baby to a hospital. Save my baby, please." Campolo confesses that he was actually relieved when the little Piper cub at last came into view, and the minute it touched down at the far end of the grass landing strip, he ran across the field to meet it. But the woman came running after him, still screaming, "Take my baby, take my baby, take my baby." Campolo climbed into the plane, he says, as quickly as he could, immediately closed the door on her, and he then told the pilot to rev up the engine, get them out of there as quickly as possible. The pilot eventually got the engine up to speed, but it wasn't soon enough, because now the woman was running alongside the plane, holding her dying child in one arm and banging on the door with the other. And finally, the airplane picked up enough speed, pulled away from her, and slowly climbed into the air. And Campolo says that he was halfway back to the Capitol when it hit him, when he finally realized what he had just done, when it suddenly dawned on him that he had actually run away from an opportunity to help one of those whom he had committed himself to serving. And as he has since written, when describing this utter lack of compassion on his part, it's good news to me that I'm saved by grace and not by works, he says, because only by the grace of God can I be saved from such failures. Now, perhaps you've never found yourself in exactly that same kind of situation that Tony did on that small landing strip there in northern Haiti years ago. Perhaps you've never faced such a heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching plea. And perhaps you've never been guilty yourself of such a blatant disregard for the suffering of others. Perhaps not. But I'd be willing to bet that at some point in the past, you've ignored a person in need, that there was at least one time when you turned the other way or walked in the opposite direction because you didn't want to get involved or were too busy to stop to help, or you just didn't plain know what to do in a particular situation, so you did nothing. I know I have. I know that I've probably just as blatantly disregarded the needs of others who were right there in front of me in my own life. But I chose not to see them, or worse yet, I simply chose not to help them. Well, in today's gospel reading that I just shared with you, we have the very same kind of situation that we're talking about here, a time when Jesus himself was faced with the obvious and compelling need of another. Jesus apparently was in Jerusalem, and on this particular occasion, he went to a certain pool, which in Hebrew is called Bethsaida. Other manuscripts identify it as Bethesda. That's what I'll use the rest of the way, where many invalids had gathered, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. Now, if you were reading this passage in your own Bible, you probably would have noticed something peculiar, namely that verse 4 is missing entirely. That's because not all the ancient manuscripts include it. But those that do tell of an old tradition that from time to time, an angel would come down from heaven and stir up the waters of the pool here at Bethesda. And then, as tradition had it, whoever was the first one to jump in and enter the water would be cured of whatever disease or ailment he or she had. Needless to say, therefore, many were apparently waiting by the pool for this very reason, and day after day as well, in the hope that they would be the lucky one to be cured. I'm reminded here of how, to this day, the sick and infirm, in fact, 80,000 annually, still make a pilgrimage to the village of Lourdes in France, where it is similarly believed that the spring water from the grotto there also has healing properties. But here's where it gets interesting. As we heard, there are many invalids there alongside the pool, each of them again in hopes of being cured. And yet, rather than cure them all in one great big flamboyant demonstration of his power, Jesus does something entirely different here. Out of all those who were there hoping to be healed, Jesus approaches the only one, a man who had been ill, we're told, for 38 years. Jesus seems to know, or at least sense, that this man he sees lying by the pool has been there for a very long time. And Jesus simply asks him, "Do you want to be made well?" And at first it sounds like a silly question, of course. Duh. Why else would he be lying there if he didn't want to be made well? But as Max Axelrod has observed, maybe there's a different way of looking at this situation. Maybe after 38 years, the man had simply become resigned to his condition, resigned to the fact that he would probably never be cured, resigned to the idea that he might have to live this way for the rest of his life. In the movie The Shawshank Redemption, there's a scene where Morgan Freeman's character has a chance at parole after being in prison for almost 40 years. But he says to one of his friends, "I don't know if I want that. I've been here most of my life. Besides, these prison walls are funny. First you're afraid of them, then you get used to them, and for a while you start relying on them. I don't know if I can make it on the outside." Well, perhaps that's what the lame man is feeling as well. There certainly does seem to be a sense of resignation as he tells Jesus that he has no one to put him into the pool when the water is being stirred up. And every time he tries to make his own way, he says someone else always beats him to it. Someone else always gets down and steps into the water first. And so, like Morgan Freeman's character, that his condition is perhaps just like a prison. First you're afraid, then you get used to it, and over time you even begin to rely and count on it as being your only reality. In other words, this man by the pool on the one hand, wants to be healed, of course, but there's another part of him that has simply gotten used to his infirmity, perhaps isn't really sure about how it would be if he truly was healed. And again, it's as if Jesus senses or understands this. And so out of all the sick people there, to possibly choose from Jesus focuses on this one invalid instead. He says to the man, "Stand up, take your mat and walk." And at once we're told the man was made well. He took up his mat and began to walk. And afterwards, of course, all the super religious folks started getting on the man's case because after all, it was the Sabbath. It was not lawful to do any work, even carrying a mat on the Sabbath. In other words, instead of being happy for the man, rejoicing over his miraculous healing, big deal for sure, all they do instead is get on his case for this relatively minor infraction. And they also want to know who it was that healed him, of course. And later, when he told them it was Jesus, we hear that it was at this point that they started persecuting Jesus for doing such things on the Sabbath. And when Jesus then defended his actions by saying, "My Father is still working, and so I am also working," they even began plotting to kill him, we're told, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but by calling God his Father, Jesus was also committing blasphemy as well, by making himself equal to God. Well, there's a lot going on there, isn't it there? But what I really want to focus on with you today is what happened immediately after the man was made well. Immediately, as we noted, everyone wanted to know who had healed him. But as we also heard, the man didn't know at first because Jesus had slipped away and disappeared into the crowd. A rather odd reaction on Jesus' part, wouldn't you say? I mean, after all, he's just healed a guy who's been sick for 38 long years. A guy who's been lying there by the pool at Bethesda day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. The other regulars all know who this guy is, and so now for him to suddenly stand up and walk is pretty amazing, to say the least. Moreover, if Jesus was going for the maximum effect here, and if his intent was to stir up some positive PR for himself, you'd have thought that he'd stick around, bask in a bit of the limelight, wouldn't you? But instead, he quietly slips into the crowd that had gathered and disappears in all the commotion. Not at all what you would expect from a guy looking for some publicity. And that's why I say, of course, it was kind of odd. Until that is, you consider the possibility that publicity and calling attention to himself were never part of the plan or the equation in the first place. Think for a moment with me and remember some of those other instances in the gospel where there's been a miraculous healing. What does he invariably tell those who've been healed? For instance, in Luke 5, verse 14, where Jesus healed a leper, afterwards says Luke, Jesus ordered him to, what? Tell no one. Again, in Luke 8, verse 56, when Jesus raised the daughter of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, her parents were astounded, says Luke, but he ordered them to tell no one what had happened. There's a pattern here, isn't there? Maybe these signs, these miracles weren't all actually part of any original plan in terms of being thought out or premeditated on Jesus's part. In other words, perhaps Jesus didn't go around intentionally looking for situations in which he could do something memorable and miraculous and then use these moments to build some street cred, so to speak, or to make a big splash and attract lots of attention to himself, or to create this image and reputation and persona of a great healer. Now, perhaps what was happening here in John 5, and as evidenced by other passages in the Gospels as well, is that Jesus didn't necessarily set out to impress people with his miracles. Instead, what simply happened perhaps was that each of these instances was completely independent of the others and therefore never part of any great plan or grand strategy. Perhaps what happened here at the pool of Bethesda and what happened when Jesus healed the royal official's son in the first half of our gospel reading this past Sunday, or even what happened when Jesus turned the water into wine at the wedding feast at Cana, was that Jesus simply found himself in a situation where there was a need that he just couldn't ignore, where he couldn't bring himself to walk away without helping, where unlike Tony Campolo and perhaps the rest of us, he just couldn't pretend that he didn't see the opportunity to serve or make up some lame excuse for not taking action. Perhaps then these were simply unplanned, spontaneous moments where Jesus was so moved by human need that he felt compelled to respond. Think back to the bridegroom who faced the shame and embarrassment of running out of wine and therefore being unable to provide for his wedding guests. Not a top 10 pressing need, perhaps, but a unique, unplanned, unrehearsed moment, nevertheless, where Jesus could show some compassion and be of help. And think about the royal official's son near death in the first half of our reading on Sunday, a much more obvious and far more serious need, to be sure. But once again, Jesus was willing to be interrupted and momentarily inconvenienced. Again, why? Because of human need, in this instance, a pressing one. Boy was gravely ill, would have undoubtedly died if Jesus hadn't intervened on his behalf. And then, of course, this was also true with the man by the pool of Bethesda. Who knows why Jesus was there that day? But once again, there doesn't seem to be any secret plan or ulterior motive on Jesus' part. However, he does seem attracted to and moved by the man's plight, and so he acts, he intervenes. Jesus sees the need and responds, no hesitation or thinking it through first. Just like that, he sees the need and acts. And that, to me, even more than the miracles themselves, is the really neat thing that I've discovered about these 7 signs in John's gospel. What begins to come through for me, and perhaps for you as well, is a Jesus who, in the process of proclaiming the kingdom of God, in other words, the great big picture stuff, is nevertheless perfectly willing, however, to stop or slow down or be interrupted, whatever the case may be, and focus instead on the little picture at times as well. That is, he came to save the entire world, and yet over and over again, he zooms in on a single person and on their particular need. And in that moment, he treats them as if they and their problem are the most important thing in the world for him, which indeed they are. And that's what's so cool. That here we have a Savior who, even though he's got this huge mission to fulfill, never forgets or loses sight of us, even the most insignificant of us, the ones whom it would be so easy to ignore or forget. And by acting this way, by setting this kind of example, what Jesus does, not merely what he says, speaks volumes. Reporters and city officials were gathered at a Chicago railroad station one afternoon back in 1953. The person they were there to meet was the 1952 Nobel Peace Prize winner. A few minutes later, after the train came to a stop, a giant of a man, 6'4" tall, with bushy white hair, large mustache, stepped from the train. Cameras flashed. City officials approached him with hands outstretched. Various people began telling him how honored they were to meet him. The man politely thanked them, and he then looking over their heads, asked if he could be excused for just a moment. And he quickly made his way through the crowd till he reached the side of an elderly black woman who was struggling with 2 large suitcases. He picked up her bags and with a smile escorted the woman to a nearby bus. And after helping her aboard, he wished her a safe journey. And as he returned to the greeting party, he apologized. "Sorry to have kept you waiting," he said. His name was Albert Schweitzer, the famous missionary doctor who had spent his life helping the poor in Africa. In response to Schweitzer's action, one member of the reception committee said with great admiration to the reporter standing next to him, "That's the first time I ever saw a sermon walking." I opened today with a story about Tony Campolo, who by his own admission missed out on a chance to help a woman and child in need. You've heard the expression, I'm sure, "can't see the forest for the trees," meaning that you're so involved in the details of a problem that you're incapable of looking at the situation as a whole. Well, the opposite can also be true sometimes. I think sometimes you can be so focused on the big picture that you're unable to see the little pieces or the little people who together make up the big picture. In other words, sometimes you can't see the trees for the forest as well. And that's perhaps what happened to Tony Campolo that day. He may have been so focused on the big picture or his mission work down there in Haiti that his mind may have been a million miles away on the day when that woman approached him and pleaded with him to take her baby in order to save the baby's life. And so as a result, he completely ignored the seriousness of her situation, even though it was so obvious and compelling, and thus completely missed out, therefore, on an opportunity for loving service. Ironically, the very thing he was down there in Haiti to accomplish in the first place. In sharp contrast, however, Albert Schweitzer, whose own missionary work completely dwarfs anything Tony Campolo has ever done or ever will do, was not so focused on the big picture or even his own fame and accomplishments that he couldn't see a much less obvious need, that elderly woman just struggling with her suitcases, or immediately go to her aid. Nor was Jesus, and that's the point. The Jesus who is emerging here in John's gospel is the Word made flesh and the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, but he was not so focused on or preoccupied with that big overall picture of his mission and ministry that he was unable to also see the needs of individual hurting people. Instead, Jesus, the Jesus we see emerging here, is someone who, when he sees a need, immediately takes action, no matter who it is or who it might offend even. with no agenda or ulterior motives, and with utter disregard for his own personal safety and well-being as well. In short, he's a Jesus who's concerned about each and every one of us and each and every one of our individual needs, and in a way that none of us, not Tony Campolo, not even Albert Schweitzer, could ever hope to enjoy or copy or emulate. And that, for me, at least, makes all the difference. Amen.